How you doing? It's Robert Band, your business finance advisor. I got a call this week from a client who said her revenues would fall 50% this month due to coronavirus and asked how to adjust her expenses given what she projected would be a 50% drop in sales for the remainder of this year. If you envision a major drop in your sales, then act now to get your overhead in line with your new revenues. Let's get right to it with some ideas on how to do this. And here I have a spreadsheet. This is a P&L. This right here, this column here is the full P&L for last year for this sample company. And revenues for product 1 were $1.5 million, and for product 2, $3 million. Some sales discounts and shipping charges, $4.5 million in revenue. Now, cost of goods sold for product 1 and 2 are shown here, and some freight in, freight out. Total cost of sales, $2.8, and gross profit, $1.6 million. And here's the view of their overhead. The warehouse expenses, labor, rent, supplies, $370, merchant processing fees, some office expenses, other G&A such as compensation for officers and office personnel, auto depreciation, other general and administrative expenses, and then there's sales and marketing, which includes advertising and sales personnel and marketing personnel. So their total overhead is $1.5 million, and their gross profit was $1.6 million. So last year, for the full year, the company made $132,000. Now, I broke down, of their costs, I broke down fixed versus variable. So every one of their costs, whether it's cost of goods or overhead, I put into either a fixed column or a variable column. Very important to know which of your overhead are fixed and which are variable. Now, let's assume, by the way, let me scroll down here, and down here is just a profile of their gross margin by product. And in product 1, they made 60% gross margin. On product 2, they made 30%. So obviously, they're working hard, but they're not making as much on product 2 as they are on product 1. Now, in the P&L, their overhead percent, which is right here, this is their total expense below gross profit, which is their overhead, and that's 34%. So on product 1, they made 26 points in excess of their overhead, and in product 2, they actually lost 4 points. So in product 2, they're not making enough to cover their overhead and add profit. So the first area, and when sales are dropping, would be to look at what is the product mix by margin and whether or not it's worth it to maintain the effort to produce this sales of product 2, which is a low margin product. Can sales prices go up? Probably not in this environment with coronavirus. Is there anything we could do to lower our cost of goods? Possibly, but probably not that much. And so this would be an area right here on product 2 that would necessitate consideration, because when you're selling this much of a product, you're incurring a lot of overhead related to those sales. And so that might be an area right away to look at as to whether to continue selling that product. Now, let's look over here. This is a 2020 forecast with an assumed sales drop of 50%. Now, this is what it looks like with half of the sales. Last year we did 4.5. This year, let's assume it goes in half. But this is before overhead cuts. So if sales drop in half and there's no changes to overhead, you'll see here, overhead, it was $1.5 million last year, and let's assume it's the same this year. Then the company's going to go from a $132,000 profit to a $700,000 loss unless it cuts its overhead. So here is where decisions can be made. Now, and this is also where the breakdown between fixed and variable comes in handy. So let's assume that sales, this column here will be after we cut overhead. Sales are half of what they were in 19, and let's assume all the margin and cost of goods and everything stays the same. So our gross profit will be half. 840 is half of last year's $1.6 million. Gross profit margin remains the same at 37. This assumes we sell both products, but just half of each one. Now, let's look at what would we do if sales went in half. So let's assume that if we're doing half the sales, we would probably have a warehouse manager, and that person's a good chunk of money, and then we keep another couple warehouse personnel, lower paid personnel, but we cut it in half. And then let's say our rent, nothing we could do about our rent unless we try and negotiate with the landlord, which we should do. Warehouse supplies, okay, they're variable. The more you buy and pack and ship, the more supplies you need. So those are variable, and those are going to go down as sales go down. Merchant processing fees are variable. As sales go down, then we incur less credit card fees. So that's going to go down by half. Let's look at office expenses. Those are largely fixed, and there's some rent, a portion to office. So that is fixed, and there's not a whole lot we could do here, so I didn't make any changes. Well, I changed it slightly, but not by much. G&A personnel, which is officer comp, let's say that, now let's talk about personnel. You can let people go, or you can have everybody agree to pay cuts. If you need to cut payroll costs, then it's either you need fewer people, or you need to cut the rate or the hours of everybody on board in order to retain everybody. If everybody won't agree to less hours or less pay rate, then you're going to be forced to cut the number of people. But you don't have to just summarily cut people. You can make it an option to your workforce as to whether everybody works less. And in coronavirus, if they can work from home, that's great. And if they work less and their paychecks are less, at least they're helping the company survive, and they'll still have a job when things start to come back. So here I did cut officers' comp, and I cut office salaries in half. Again, if sales are down, then it probably means less sales invoicing, less collections effort, and this may require that employees whose duties are shrinking because sales have shrunk, that maybe now they have to take on other duties, and that may mean less personnel. So if you do have to lower the employee count, then with somebody whose duties have shrunk, they can take on more duties because they have more time. Okay, so health insurance would go down, payroll taxes would go down. Auto, let's assume they're auto leases, and there's nothing that could happen with those. Those are fixed. Bank charges largely are fixed. Depreciation is fixed. Insurance, accounting fees. Well, insurance is largely fixed. I did cut accounting and professional fees. Travel, I cut here. Figure, less trade shows or less travel overall. Telephone, not much you could do. It's fixed largely. On sales and marketing, okay, so advertising, search engine advertising could go to zero. This is a variable cost. Actually, this is fixed in my model here. But if you had to make some hard choices, you could eliminate it. Social media advertising, ad agency, you could cut back on. You could cut back on this until things resume and start to become somewhat normal again. Sales personnel, you might have to either reduce comp of 2 salespeople or cut one and commissions will obviously go down. Actually, commissions should be in the variable column. So let me switch that. But anyway, they will go down with lower sales, and as will payroll taxes and health insurance. So by making these changes, I was able to have our overhead and get, our sales are going down by half. So here I cut overhead in half and got the P&L into a sort of pretty much a break even for the year, as opposed to a $700,000 loss. So these are some of the ways that you can, immediately adjust your P&L, albeit with some tough choices. But if you don't, you're going to have a lot of losses, and you're going to have to put more cash in the business, or you may not make it. That's a little bit on how you can adjust your expenses immediately if you see your revenue dropping precipitously. This is Robert Band, your business finance expert. Would you like better financial management that leads to better results? Then let me put the right pieces in place for you. Remember, one tip could be worth millions, and profits today by way of compounding of interest become fortunes tomorrow. So please don't let them fall through the cracks. I'll see you next time.